At some point during a formal evening in the 1950s or early 1960s, a state banquet, a diplomatic function, one of the countless occasions that constituted the social calendar of the British royal household, a man stood beside Princess Margaret for the entire duration of the event. He wasn't a guest, he wasn't eating. He was holding an ashtray. The room would have been exactly what you're imagining. Long tables dressed in white linen, silver candelabra throwing warm light across the faces of ambassadors and ministers and their wives, footmen moving at the edges, music at a careful volume. Princess Margaret would have been somewhere near the center of it, brilliant with jewelry, immaculately turned out, the cigarette held at the angle that had become, by her 30s, as much a part of her physical signature as her height. 5 feet, roughly, in heels. A slight, contained figure who nevertheless occupied whatever room she entered completely. His name was Peter Russell, and he had been doing variations of this for years. He served in the British royal household from 1954 to 1968. 14 years of standing in the right position at the right moment, with whatever was required. At these evening functions, what was required was an ashtray. The princess smoked constantly and heavily. The job of the ashtray holder was to remain close, at the correct angle, within easy reach, so that when she wanted to flick her ash, she wouldn't need to look for somewhere to put it. She would simply flick, and the ashtray would be there. The person holding it wouldn't exist in any sense that counted. That isn't a figure of speech. Russell described it in precise professional terms in a documentary on royal servants, widely referred to as royal servants or royal servants behind closed doors. At a banquet, for instance, or a big social function, he said, it meant you had to dance attendance on her all night long, by possibly just standing to her left or right with an ashtray, so she didn't have to look to see where she flicked her ash. 4 hours, perhaps 5, standing, watching, not speaking unless spoken to, moving when she moved, stopping when she stopped, adjusting position as the evening progressed through its stages. The drinks before dinner, the seating, the courses, the speeches, the gradual loosening that comes after the second bottle of wine. Through all of it, the ashtray, held at the right height, ready at the right moment, the ash flicked without a glance in his direction, because there was no need to glance. He was there. He was always there. He also offered the observation that governs the entire structure of the relationship. They want you there because they can't manage without you. The phrasing is careful, controlled, and utterly revealing. They want you there. They can't manage without you. You are essential and invisible. That tension, held across 14 years, is the texture of what it meant to serve Princess Margaret. Most people who know her at all know her through a screen. 3 main actresses played her across The Crown's 6 seasons: Vanessa Kirby in the early years, and again in season 5, Helena Bonham Carter through the middle period, Leslie Manville through the final seasons, and her decline. The show's version is a recognizable portrait: brilliant, volatile, heavy drinking, resentful of the constitutional cage she'd been born into, and ultimately a figure who commands something between pity and admiration. Helena Bonham Carter, preparing for the role, met with people who had known Margaret personally and reportedly sought the late princess's blessing through a psychic before filming began. The production wanted to do right by her. The people who actually served her had a different experience. Russell was one of them, and he wasn't the only one who talked.
Margaret Rose was born on August 21, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland, her mother's ancestral home, the Strathmore family seat, a vast medieval structure in the Angus countryside whose towers had been visible from the surrounding farmland for 600 years. Her father was then Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V. Her mother was Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. Her sister Elizabeth was 4 years older. Their father wasn't expected to be king, and the household they grew up in reflected that. Wealthy, ceremonial, attended by a full staff, but not the eye of the constitutional storm. They were royal daughters of the secondary branch. They were expected to marry well, attend functions, and let their elder relatives carry the public weight. December 10, 1936, changed the arithmetic permanently. Edward VIII signed the Instrument of Abdication. George VI formally acceded the following day. Margaret was 6 years old. From that morning, her position was fixed with the precision of a constitutional document. Her sister Elizabeth, aged 10, became heir presumptive, and Margaret became the daughter of the king. Important, ceremonially visible, the subject of enormous public interest, but never the monarch, never the heir, never the person whose every action carried the weight of succession. She held all of royalty's obligations, the protocol, the ceremonial duty, the impossibility of ordinary friendships or ordinary work, the understanding that everything she said in public was representational and nothing she might want was straightforwardly permitted. And she had, as the years passed, a sister who had all of those same constraints and also a purpose, a reason to endure them, a constitutional role that made sense of the sacrifice, a function that would absorb her entire life and give it a legible shape. What Margaret had was the ceremony without the justification. Even within the household itself, the pattern had been observed early. Queen Mary's own lady-in-waiting wrote to the princess's governess in the 1930s that Her Majesty was rather sorry to hear that Princess Margaret is so spoilt, though perhaps it's hardly surprising. This observation wasn't tabloid speculation. It came from inside the royal family's closest circle, from the staff who attended the family itself, passed between women whose entire professional lives were organized around the task of managing how this family was perceived. The people nearest the household had concluded, when Margaret was still in primary school, that she was being indulged in ways that would compound with age. They were right about what was coming. To understand what serving Princess Margaret actually required of the people around her, it helps to move through a single representative morning in approximately 1955. Craig Brown reconstructed this routine in his 2017 biography, Ma'am Darling, 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, published by Fourth Estate in London on September 21, 2017. A portrait assembled from decades of interviews, memoirs, diaries, celebrity accounts, and newspaper records that went on to win the James Tate Black Memorial Prize for Biography in 2018, one of Britain's oldest and most credentialed literary awards. What Brown describes isn't presented as an extraordinary day. It's presented as Tuesday. At 9 o'clock in the morning, a maid brings breakfast to the bedroom. Not downstairs, not at a table, not dressed, in bed, against pillows, in whatever private state the preceding evening has left her. The breakfast tray goes on the bedclothes. The newspapers follow. For the next 2 hours, she does not get up. She reads, or rather, she moves through the newspapers in the way that people move through something they own rather than something they've sought out, with authority, with leisure, with the implicit understanding that the world in the papers has arranged itself for her review. The radio is on. The cigarette is lit. As Brown records it, the newspapers she invariably left scattered over the floor around her, dropped where she finished with them because someone would collect them, because someone was always going to collect them, because the entire architecture of her life was built on the assumption of collection. Try to see it concretely. The bedroom of a princess in the mid-1950s, curtains drawn against the morning light, the BBC home service at low volume, the smell of tobacco building in the closed air, newspapers spread across the floor in a rough radius around the bed. 2 hours of this. The maid who brought the tray does not return until she's wanted.
At 11, the maid runs the bath. Not a quick 5 minutes, an hour. The bathroom fills with steam. The newspapers stay on the floor where they landed. The cigarette is presumably stubbed out, though the smoking resumed at the dressing table and continued through the day with the consistency of a professional obligation. Brown's account places the cigarette as a near constant. The staff account of what the cigarette required of other people's bodies has already been established by Russell. At noon, she moves from bathroom to dressing table. Hair is dressed, makeup is applied, a process requiring skill, attention, and someone else's hands. Then she is clothed. Here is a detail from Brown's reconstruction that repays close attention. She never wore any of her clothes more than once without having them cleaned. Every garment, every time. Before it touched her a second time, it had been laundered, pressed, hung, and returned to circulation. The wardrobe rotation this implies, the tracking of what had been worn and when, the management of volume, the timing of returns from the laundry, was a continuous, intricate enterprise running parallel to her life, but entirely beneath her line of sight. She didn't think about the logistics. She thought about what she wanted to wear. The logistics were someone else's body and someone else's day. At 12:30, a vodka arrives. Brown records it as a pick-me-up, the language of something routine, something expected, something that has been delivered at this time long enough that it no longer needs to be asked for. It simply appears. At 1 o'clock, she joins the Queen Mother for a 4-course lunch, served from silver dishes, informally, with approximately half a bottle of wine per person, followed by fruit and a selection of native and continental cheeses. That is the morning. Before she has eaten lunch, the labor of multiple people has been organized entirely around her physical state. The maid who ran the bath, the staff who managed the wardrobe, the person who timed the vodka, the cook who prepared the 4 courses. All of this happening simultaneously, in quiet coordination, invisible and unacknowledged, because acknowledgement wasn't part of the arrangement. The ritual matters not because it's unique to Margaret. Multiple daily wardrobe changes and elaborate staff routines were standard across the royal household and aristocracy of the era, but because of what the witnesses describe about its texture and its requirements. These aren't individual demands. They are the grammar of a life in which other people's bodies and schedules were the infrastructure of her existence, and in which that infrastructure was, by design, invisible. When Russell speaks about the ashtray duty, the detail he emphasizes is the duration. Not just that he held the ashtray. Anyone can hold something for a moment. What he describes is sustained, night-long presence, standing to her left or right, moving with her through the room, holding it at the right height through courses and speeches, and the long social tale of a formal evening, available for the entire event because she might need it at any second, and couldn't be expected to look around for it when she did. He also documented one of the more telling protocols of the household. Princess Margaret required staff to address her as "Ma'am Darling," a combination of formal title and casual endearment that positioned the speaker simultaneously as subordinate and intimate. The requirement wasn't informal shorthand that evolved naturally from long acquaintance. It was stipulated. Deference through warmth, warmth through deference, both enforced simultaneously. Craig Brown titled his entire book after this formulation, and the choice is precise. The title captures the whole of her in 2 words: Ma'am, darling. You understood which one you were. You understood, moreover, that you were being asked to perform intimacy while standing at the correct professional distance, that the warmth was a service, not a relationship, and that it could be withdrawn or redirected without the slightest adjustment to your title. The physical requirements extended beyond formal occasions. Staff who worked in her household were expected to remain available until she had returned for the evening and had no further need of them, which, given her active and frequently late social calendar, meant nights that ran well past midnight with some regularity. The servants weren't working a defined shift with a clear end time they could orient themselves around.
They were available for the duration of her waking life, and her waking life observed no particular schedule that took other people's rhythms into account. Lady Anne Glenconner spent 30 years navigating these demands. Born Anne Coke, she had known the royal sisters since childhood and served as one of Queen Elizabeth II's maids of honor at the 1953 coronation. In 1971, Margaret appointed her as extra lady-in-waiting at Margaret's personal request, a role Glenconner held until Margaret's death in February 2002. Her 2019 memoir, Lady-in-Waiting: My Extraordinary Life in the Shadow of the Crown, published by Hodder and Stoughton, is primarily an affectionate account. "I absolutely loved it," she has said of the role. She describes laughing with Margaret more than with almost anyone else in her life. The memoir does not present a villain, but the memoir documents specific episodes that illuminate the texture of service. Despite a childhood friendship that predated both of their adult lives, they had known each other since before Elizabeth's coronation, Glenconner was required to address Margaret as "ma'am" at all times, even in private. The form held regardless of context. You could have known her for 50 years and still, in private, in a room with no one else present, addressed her with the same title used in official public functions. The intimacy of 3 decades of close friendship didn't alter the requirement by a word. And there is the week during which Margaret became ill in an unfamiliar house and refused to allow the household servants into the room. Glenconner attended to her personal needs for the entire duration. She slept beside her. She cleaned the room. She brought meals, managed everything Margaret required, was the room's only occupant other than the patient, for a full week, while the people whose professional responsibility it actually was waited outside in the corridor. Glenconner does not present this in the memoir as a complaint. She appears to have accepted it as part of what the role required of the person who held it. But the acceptance itself is the evidence. A woman who genuinely loved the job, who has described it as one of the great privileges of her life, who spent a week of that life attending to the bodily needs of someone who preferred her to the household servants, while those servants waited in the hall. When Glenconner was asked about Craig Brown's book, the prize-winning, assembled portrait that would become the most thorough public record of Margaret's social behavior, she described it as, "that horrible book. We won't mention the name of the somebody who wrote it. I don't know why people want to rot her like that." Brown's book won Britain's most prestigious biographical prize. Her closest, long-serving friend called it horrible. Both of those facts are true simultaneously, and the space between them is itself a form of evidence about the woman at the center. The broader pattern assembles itself from encounters across different decades, different kinds of relationships, and consistently similar outcomes. Twiggy, Leslie Hornby, who had become by the late 1960s one of the most recognized women in the world, a face that appeared on magazine covers on every continent, described a dinner at which Princess Margaret barely acknowledged her. When Twiggy introduced herself, the response was 2 words: "How unfortunate." No elaboration, no modification. The story emerged through a television appearance on Parkinson and was reproduced by Craig Brown. The contempt is calibrated precisely to sting while maintaining the fiction of civility. A put-down so refined that it takes a moment to fully register, and then another moment to appreciate the craft of it. It isn't crude. It does not raise a voice or make a scene. It simply reduces the other person's existence to an inconvenience and moves on. Rupert Everett described an evening at Kensington Palace, during which he failed to light Princess Margaret's cigarette at the expected moment. The expectation was entirely unspoken. It was universal among anyone who had encountered her before, and entirely invisible to those who hadn't. You were expected to know. You were expected to have the lighter ready, to move with precision, to complete the action before she had to ask or even gesture. The discomfort that followed his failure was visible to everyone in the room.
The silence that arrives when someone has committed a violation in a language they didn't know existed, and everyone else suddenly knows. And no one says anything, because saying something would require acknowledging the rule, and the rule wasn't supposed to be stated. It was supposed to be innate. He had violated a standard he hadn't been told about, and the violation was communicated not through correction, but through the particular temperature of the room for the rest of the evening. Both of those incidents are small. That is precisely the point. The overall picture the record draws isn't one dramatic confrontation, but a consistent texture. The repeated discovery by people in her orbit that they had failed to perform to a standard they hadn't been shown, and that the failure cost them something in the economy of the room, while she continued undisturbed. There is also the exchange between Margaret and Elizabeth Taylor, documented in Craig Brown's assembled portrait. When Richard Burton bought Taylor the enormous Krupp diamond, Margaret, who didn't particularly get along with Taylor, reportedly pronounced it the most vulgar thing she had ever seen. This observation reached Taylor, as things in that world tended to do, and when both women were subsequently at the same party, Taylor asked the princess if she'd like to try the ring on. Margaret put it on. Taylor looked at it on her hand and suggested that it didn't look quite so vulgar now, did it? Then she walked away. Taylor got the last word, which was remarkable, because relatively few people managed that. The anecdote circulates as comedy, but the structure underneath it, one woman deploying social dominance as an automatic reflex, another woman preparing and executing a response that couldn't be countered, says something precise about the nature of the dynamic Margaret created in every room she entered. Then there is the incident at a Beverly Hills hotel party during Margaret's 1965 U.S. tour. The evening included among its guests Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, and Grace Kelly, the full constellation of mid-century celebrity that Margaret habitually moved among as an equal or better. Judy Garland was also there. What happened next was documented by the biographer Theo Aronson in his biography of Princess Margaret, and later reproduced by Craig Brown. As Aronson's account has it, Margaret wanted Garland to sing. The want was communicated not by asking Garland directly, not by walking across the room, introducing herself if an introduction were needed, and making the request in person, but by sending an aide as intermediary. The aide was dispatched to convey the princess's wish. Garland would sing. That was the arrangement. Garland didn't see it that way. She had known Margaret, at least by acquaintance, for long enough that a personal approach would have been the reasonable minimum. Being summoned through a messenger, as if she were a hotel employee, as if the nature of her art and her status in the room didn't require the ordinary courtesy of a direct request, was, in Garland's reading, an insult. Her response, as multiple sources transmit it, was to send her own message back through the aide. That Margaret was a nasty, rude little princess, that they had known each other long enough for Margaret to ask herself, and that before Garland would perform on command, Margaret was welcome to go and christen a ship. The refusal is remarkable for what it reveals about the assumptions behind the original request. You don't send an aide to summon a performance from Judy Garland at a private party unless you genuinely believe that the wish to hear music is sufficient justification for the summoning, and that the artist's own sense of how she should be approached is secondary. It's an assumption that works reliably when directed at people in service roles, people who are professionally oriented around your wishes and whose refusal carries professional consequences. Garland wasn't in a service role. She was a peer in the room, by any reasonable measure, a peer of greater fame and considerably greater artistic achievement, and she declined to accept the reframing. The moment illuminates something the servant accounts can't quite reach, what the compliance of years produces in a person. When everyone around you has spent years managing your preferences, receiving your ash, addressing you as "ma'am darling," timing your vodka, and presenting you with freshly cleaned clothes before noon, you arrive at parties with expectations that the room hasn't necessarily agreed to share. And when someone declines to share them, the surprise is real. Running through all of this, as a consistent counterpoint, is the testimony of Gore Vidal. In a piece published in The New Yorker in 1996 titled "Dinner with the Princess," Vidal described an evening with Margaret in Rome as one of the more remarkable social experiences of his career. He called her remarkably charming and witty. He suggested she was far too intelligent for a role she took too seriously. Vidal isn't a soft witness, and his account is enthusiastic enough to require taking seriously. The key is who Margaret was performing for. She was in the company of Gore Vidal, a writer she regarded as a genuine intellectual peer, someone worth the effort. In that context, with those stakes, she could be extraordinary. The effort was made because the person opposite her had something she wanted: intellectual exchange, recognition, the particular pleasure of being met by someone capable of meeting her. The servants who stood with ashtrays encountered a different woman. That disparity isn't a contradiction in the evidence, it's the evidence. Margaret's behavior wasn't constant. It modulated based on what she was getting from the person in front of her. People she considered worth impressing received the version Vidal describes. People who existed to serve her received the version Russell describes. The people who served her had no opportunity to move between those categories. You couldn't, by outstanding ashtray work, acquire the status of someone worth a genuine effort. The categories were fixed at the moment of introduction by your function in the room, and 14 years of loyal service didn't reclassify what you were. The book that assembled the fullest account of the pattern is Craig Brown's "Ma'am Darling, 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret," and it's worth being precise about what the book is and what it isn't. Brown is a British journalist and satirist who has written Private Eye's parodic political diary columns since 1989 and spent decades as the senior book critic at the Mail on Sunday. He isn't a conventional biographer working from newly discovered archives. His method, as the publisher describes it, is a kaleidoscopic experiment in biography. 99 short chapters in non-chronological order, mixing interviews, diary transcriptions, parodies, invented alternative life sequences, celebrity encounters, staff accounts, and newspaper cuttings into something that is harder to categorize than a standard biography and considerably harder to dismiss. Brown has written that biography is the most sheepish and constrained of the arts, and the least like life, and royal biography doubly so. His method is a response to that constraint. Since the interior of a royal life is inaccessible, and the official version is shaped by layers of deference and legal caution, you build the portrait from the edges, from every witness, every diarist, every footman, every celebrity who happened to leave a record of what it was like to be in the room. The shape that emerges from multiple independent testimonies across decades and contexts is as reliable a portrait as the genre allows. In Julian Barnes's review in The Guardian, Brown has managed to ingest huge numbers of books about Margaret and produced something very funny and full of quirky facts and genial footnotes. The Times reviewer called the subject on the evidence Brown assembled a ghastly human being, while acknowledging the dazzle. Vogue's review described the portrait Brown constructs as a chain-smoking, chain-drinking, man-eating monster with flashes of wit and enchantment. The Times literary supplement, reviewing in November 2017, called it a fresh template for the biographical form itself, a new way of doing what biography has always tried to do, but rarely managed honestly. In August 2018, the University of Edinburgh's James Tate Black Memorial Prize judges gave Brown the Biography Prize for this work. The prize was established in 1919 and is among Britain's oldest and most continuously maintained literary awards, administered by academics and designed to reward serious biographical engagement with a human life. That an experimental, satirical, impressionistic collage of staff testimony, celebrity anecdotes, archival fragments, and invented parallel histories won a prize of that stature is a statement about how seriously the assembled evidence can be taken, how much of it there was, how coherently it spoke, and how much it had to say that more decorous methods would have missed. Glenn Connor called it a horrible book. The University of Edinburgh gave it their oldest prize. Both judgments are sincere. Both say something about the woman at the center of it. The Crown's version of Princess Margaret, across 6 seasons and 3 actresses, made specific creative choices about how to present her, and those choices run consistently in one direction. The show depicted her drinking, her parties, her resentment of the constitutional cage, the deterioration of her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones, the complex and painful relationships with men she loved in various registers and couldn't have on her own terms. It showed Margaret as a figure whose behavior emerged comprehensibly from an impossible situation. Brilliant and underutilized, given all of royalty's constraints and almost none of its compensations. Intelligent enough to know exactly what she was missing and unable to do anything about it. Helena Bonham Carter's preparation, meeting people who knew Margaret, reportedly seeking her blessing through a medium, reflects a production oriented toward honoring its subject rather than dissecting her. Leslie Manville played the final years, the strokes, the deterioration, with something approaching grace. All 3 actresses brought what good actors bring to complicated people, the work of making behavior legible from the inside. What the show does not examine in any sustained way is the daily apparatus of deference surrounding her. The man standing with an ashtray for 4 hours at a banquet, the clothes laundered before they could touch her a second time, the "ma'am, darling" that a 30-year friend was still required to use in private. The vodka at 12:30 as a daily institution rather than a scene of character revelation. The consistent pattern, not the dramatic incident, but the daily, repeated pattern of people in her orbit discovering that they had violated an unspoken rule and absorbing the cost of that violation while she continued undisturbed. The on-screen Margaret is comprehensible. The show explains her, contextualizes her, positions her behavior as the legible product of an impossible situation. The Margaret in the documented record isn't incomprehensible, but she is harder. The screen version makes you understand her. The servant's version recorded her. Those are different projects, and they produce different conclusions from the same life. Russell's documentary testimony does not appear in The Crown. The ashtray, held all night long, isn't a scene. The "ma'am, darling" requirement exists in the show's very title while remaining unexamined in its scenes. The vodka at 12:30 is present as a character texture, but is never shown from the perspective of someone who had to time it correctly, deliver it at the right moment to the right place, every day, without being asked and without being thanked. The newspapers scattered on the floor aren't in the frame. The wardrobe rule, never worn twice without cleaning, has consequences that are entirely invisible in a drama that is oriented around the person wearing the clothes rather than the people cycling them through the laundry. The correction the eyewitness record offers isn't that the show was dishonest. It's that the show made consistent choices toward sympathy and comprehension. Choices any thoughtful dramatist would make, and those choices, maintained across 6 seasons and 2 decades of screen time,
produced a version that the people who served her wouldn't have fully recognized as the woman they spent their working lives attending. The contrast with her sister is the element of the story most often asserted and least often documented with specific named testimony. The honest account of what the record actually contains is this: no named individual appears in publicly available sources as having served both Princess Margaret and Queen Elizabeth II and offered a direct comparative statement about the experience. The contrast, as it exists in the documented record, is drawn by biographers and cultural observers working from separate streams of evidence, not by a single witness standing astride both households. But what assembles itself from multiple independent directions is coherent. Queen Elizabeth II is characterized, across decades of biographical work and public record, as someone who understood the role as service, who had inherited a position she had not sought and made of it a discipline rather than an entitlement. The people who worked closest to her across her decades of reign didn't generate the pattern of documented grievance that accumulated around her sister. The ashtray problem, at least in its documented form, belonged to one household. Margaret had the same origins. The same December morning in 1936 altered both their lives. They were raised in the same house, with the same understanding of what royalty required and what it denied. The difference lies in what each chose to do with that understanding. Brown's assembled text includes a passage that locates Margaret's psychology with unusual precision. She, he writes, remained conscious of the image of the one who wasn't, and to some extent played on it. The one who wasn't the queen, the one who wasn't taught constitutional history because she wasn't the one who'd be needing it. The one who wasn't in the first coach and wouldn't ever be the first onto Buckingham Palace balcony. She understood her position. She understood it as a structure of deprivations, things withheld, roles unassigned, coaches that didn't carry her. And she defined herself partly through that structure of deprivation for 5 decades. The people who stood with ashtrays didn't create the constitutional arrangement that placed Elizabeth first. They weren't responsible for the abdication, the accession, or any of the arithmetic that fixed each sister in her position. They arrived at work each morning, stood in the positions she required, and what they encountered there wasn't the philosophical melancholy of a woman with cause to feel diminished, but the practical expectation of compliance from a person who had received compliance her entire life, and saw no reason at this remove to revise the terms. Whether her position explains her behavior is one question. Whether it justifies what the servants experienced is another. The two questions aren't the same, and the servants' record answers the second, while leaving the first to the biographers and the actors and the prize committees. The shape of the record itself, who produced it, when, under what circumstances, deserves attention before reaching the end. Royal service has historically been conducted in near total silence. Staff members don't speak publicly about what they witness. They don't publish memoirs without consequence. Ladies-in-waiting maintain the form. Footmen retire. The institutional culture surrounding the British royal family has discouraged disclosure with the efficiency of generations of practiced expectation, reinforced by legal agreements that formalize what everyone already understands is required of them. The palace runs, in part, on the certainty that the people inside it won't describe what they saw. Against that background, what is remarkable about the Princess Margaret record isn't that a few disaffected servants complained. It's that the complaints were specific enough to be reproducible, came from multiple independent sources across different decades and different types of relationships, and accumulated into a portrait coherent enough that the assembled version won Britain's oldest biographical prize. Peter Russell went on the record in a documentary and co-authored a book with Paul James, a butler willing to attach his name to his account in print when the culture around him argued strongly for silence.
Lady Anne Glenconner published a memoir at the age of 86 that, while fundamentally affectionate, documented specific episodes that her evident love for the subject couldn't quite soften out of the text. Theo Aronson recorded the Garland encounter in a formal biographical work. Brown spent years ingesting the accumulated documentary and memoir record and produced 432 pages from it. Twiggy appeared on Parkinson. Rupert Everett gave interviews. These people didn't coordinate. They came from different decades, different contexts, different relationships to the subject.
Russell had been a palace employee doing professional work. Glenconner had been a lifelong friend doing what she understood as a labor of devotion. Twiggy had been a celebrity at a dinner, present for perhaps 2 hours. And they described, across all of that variation in experience and relationship, the same essential texture. A person who inhabited deference as a law of nature, who organized every relationship around the management of her own needs, and who left in the people who served her the particular fatigue of having attended, at length and over time, to someone who never quite registered that the attending had occurred. One line from Brown's assembled portrait lingers. A friend of Margaret's, someone who knew her closely enough to assess her with neither tabloid cruelty nor courtly loyalty, said he had never known an unhappier woman. The observation is sympathetic. It positions the behavior as the product of unhappiness, something that came from somewhere real and painful, and in part structurally imposed. But the servants who stood with ashtrays weren't paid to manage her unhappiness. They were paid to manage her needs. And if those needs grew from unhappiness that was genuine, the people who cleaned her clothes and ran her bath and held the ashtray through 4-hour banquets still had to be there, still had to do it, and still had to present themselves the following morning, ready to do it again, at 9 o'clock when the breakfast arrived in bed and the newspapers were scattered across the floor. Princess Margaret died on February 9, 2002, at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, aged 71. She had suffered a series of strokes beginning in 1998. Her lifelong heavy smoking and heavy drinking, documented extensively across the staff accounts and confirmed in the biographical record, had materially contributed to the deterioration of her health. The smoking that Peter Russell had attended to, ashtray in hand, for 14 years of his working life, was the smoking that would eventually help kill her. She had been, in many respects, exactly what the structure she was born into might predictably produce. The indulged child that Queen Mary's lady-in-waiting noted in the 1930s became the demanding adult the royal household servants documented across 5 subsequent decades. At each stage, she received what she required, and what she required didn't diminish with age. The demands became more precise, more elaborated, more finely calibrated to the exact dimensions of the deference she was owed. The cup was filled, repeatedly, by a succession of people whose names history mostly didn't preserve, and it was never quite sufficient. The Crown told one version of this story. It wasn't dishonest, but it was sympathetic. The version that explains her, contextualizes the behavior as the comprehensible product of an impossible position. Vanessa Kirby brought intelligence and fire. Helena Bonham Carter brought damage and genuine skill. Leslie Manville played the final years with something close to grace. They were working from scripts designed to make you understand her, and they largely succeeded. Peter Russell was working from a different kind of assignment: to stand where she pointed, hold what she handed him, anticipate what she hadn't yet asked for, and be in the correct position without being told, all night long, because she couldn't manage without people who did exactly that. When he eventually described the work, with his name attached, in a documented format, as a verified 14-year presence in the household,
He didn't produce an outburst or a grievance. He produced a professional account of a professional requirement, stated in the careful language of someone who had managed, for over a decade, to say nothing. At a banquet, for instance, or a big social function, it meant you had to dance attendance on her all night long. That sentence is precise and unembroidered.
It contains every argument this documentary record is capable of making. The screen versions were built by people who wanted you to understand her. The documented record was built by people who had been there, and what they recorded, the rituals, the demands, the vodka at 12:30, the clothes laundered before they could touch her a second time, the ashtray held through 4-hour evenings by a man whose name she wasn't required to remember. The "Ma'am, darling," deployed in empty rooms between people who had known each other for 30 years, was harder, more specific, and more unflattering than anything television chose to show. She had every advantage a life could hold: birth into one of the most consequential families in the world, extraordinary wealth, access to the most powerful rooms in Britain, the most famous sister on Earth. She entered every room as its center and left it as the last one out. The people paid to make this possible outlasted the requirement, and when they finally spoke, they spoke with the particular precision of people who had watched very carefully for a very long time. The eyewitness record they left isn't a tabloid product. It isn't a screenwriter's interpretation. It's the assembled, named, prize-winning, on-camera account of people who had been in the room, who had held the ashtray and run the bath, and poured the vodka and said, "Ma'am, darling," and waited in the corridor, and who had no reason, none, given the institutional pressure against disclosure that surrounded the palace, to say anything at all, and who said it anyway. That record says she was harder than the screen version. The people who stood beside her said so first. Subscribe for more stories like this.